Welcome to the Business Interview. I'm Markus Karlsson. The future of Ukraine is being sketched out after the dramatic departure of Viktor Yanukovych from the presidency. There's a lot of political uncertainty, but one certainty looking ahead is Ukraine's huge economic challenge. The country's cash-strapped and needs outside help to avoid going bankrupt. Russia pledged $15 billion at the end of last year, but put the lifeline on hold, quoting political turmoil. At the same time, there are warnings that Russian banks will take a hard hit if Ukraine defaults on its debts. To talk more about Ukraine's economy and the Russian connection, we can turn to Ronald Freeman, who's with us from London. He's part of the think tank, the Atlantic Council. He's also a board member at some of Russia's biggest companies, including lender Sberbank and steelmaker Severstal. Thank you very much indeed, Ronald, for being with us today.
Thank you, Markus.
Let me first ask you this. How big do you think the risk is of a Ukrainian default?
At this point, Sberbank, who is the biggest lender in the private sector to Ukraine, has $4 billion plus of loans to various Ukrainian borrowers. So far, and as we speak only so far, those loans are overwhelmingly current and in good shape. There's been no sign in the last week or two of any increase in defaults on those existing loans to a full range of Ukrainian borrowers. So far, so good.
So Sberbank, at least the bank that you're a board member at, is not preparing for a Ukrainian default in the next few weeks or months.
Well, you may have seen that the chief executive officer of Sberbank, Herman Gref, announced on Wednesday of last week that they would not make new loans in Ukraine until the situation clarified. So they're watching it closely. But meanwhile, business that's already been made seems to be in normal shape, and people are paying their loans on time so far.
What do you think the risk is of contagion from the Ukrainian situation economically?
Well, you have to look at it in terms of what's going on at the grassroots. Ukrainian businessmen have the same problems businessmen have everywhere. You have to pay your suppliers, you have to pay your employees, you have to give credit to your customers. If you can't pay your employees, then they don't work. They go out on the street and the mobs get worse and the bad feelings get worse. So far, there has not been problems of mass non-payment of employees in the private sector. The problems have been in the government sector. People who were building one of Yanukovych's palaces, so they weren't being paid, they walked off the job. That kind of thing can become the snowball that we're worried about and that you've just mentioned.
Now, if Ukraine were to default on its debts, if Ukraine were to run out of money, how much a hit would that be for Russia and also Russian companies?
People who have bought Ukrainian sovereign bonds, which is the debt that people are most afraid of seeing a default on, are a very wide range of borrowers. And Russia is not a major buyer currently of Ukrainian sovereign bonds. They would be one of many creditors who would be hurt by a Ukrainian sovereign default.
When we look at the lifeline that Russia offered Ukraine at the end of last year, what do you think the probability is that Moscow will go through on that? It's voiced some reservations when it comes to paying out tranches of that lifeline.
Well, there was a quid pro quo for that lifeline. In exchange for the lifeline and for reducing the cost of gas that Russia sells to Ukraine, Russia wanted Ukraine to extend the lease on Russia's Black Sea fleet located in the Crimea, in Sevastopol. So it was just not a pure economic or financial deal. It was also a political deal. And the political side of it, having the Black Sea Fleet station in Crimea, is still very much part of Russia's military setup. So there might be some give and take on both sides.
How would you say that economic relations are between the two countries at this stage? What do they actually look like?
Well, there's a lot of Russian investment in Ukraine. Russian steel companies, Russian engineering companies, Russian construction companies have been major investors in the country to the extent that any foreign power has been. And those relationships, while they don't produce great fortunes for the Russian businessmen, by and large, they work reasonably well. We have to remember Ukraine is a poor country. The per capita GDP of Ukraine is about $4,000 compared to Russia, which is about $14,000. Or France, which is $40,000. So they're doing the kind of business that people do from abroad in a poor country, which is what Ukraine still is. It shouldn't be, but it is.
Is Russia's large economic role in Ukraine part of the thinking in Moscow? The Russian government has made it quite clear that it doesn't like what's happening across the border. But will Russia help out nonetheless because of its economic interests in Ukraine? What's your sense when it comes to that?
Russia has a huge economic interest in Ukraine. Ukraine stands between Russia and Europe. Europe is Russia's big customer for gas so far. The pipeline, which transports Russian gas across Ukraine into Europe, is a major asset of great importance to the Russians. That pipeline is currently owned by the Ukrainians. There have been discussions in the past about privatizing the pipeline, a sale and leaseback, so that the Russian shippers would have a better view of what's happening to their gas inside that pipeline. Russian companies are major investors in Ukraine. Russia has every interest in keeping Ukraine peaceful and solvent and together.
Now, Ukrainian officials say that the country may need as much as $35 billion this year and the next year as well to survive. Who will come to its rescue when it comes to that kind of cash?
Well, I've seen that number too, Marcus. That $35 billion number as relates to outstanding sovereign debt and obligations to Ukrainian government employees. The more urgent one is making sure employees are getting their paychecks. People do have to live from day to day. Insofar as sovereign debt is concerned, we've all seen from European upheavals in the last couple of years that those near-term maturities of sovereign debt can be worked out, can be rolled over, can be extended with the agreement of lenders. These are the kinds of things that the IMF is constituted to do. The most urgent need is keeping the day-to-day economy going. And Russia is better positioned than anybody else, better than the IMF, better than the EBRD, because they are in daily contact with the Ukrainian economy. That's why peace and normal business conditions are so important to all parties here.
Just looking there at that question on who is going to come to Ukraine's aid, do you think that Ukraine will have to choose between the West and Russia at some point? Will it be able to balance the two?
I think there's a dichotomy, and I think Sergei Lavrov, Russia's extremely experienced and highly regarded foreign minister, has said this. This is not a zero-sum game. It's not one or the other. It's both. Ukraine needs Europe as a trading partner, as well as a political friend, and Ukraine needs Russia. There's no reason it cannot be on friendly terms with both, assuming the Russians and the Europeans can agree, and there's no reason they cannot agree. Sergei Lavrov has worked closely with his opposite numbers in the EU, in Poland, in Germany, in the United States. These foreign ministers can sit around a table, as they did last week, and cut a deal that makes sure that Russia and the others will sustain Ukraine as a going country. And we do not need a war in the middle of Europe. We need normal diplomatic relationships. This is not a time for soldiers. It's a time for diplomats.
We have seen some market concerns, though, when it comes to tensions on the border between Ukraine and Russia. It sounds as if you're saying that perhaps, at least from the Russian perspective, we should be playing down those tensions.
Exactly. But I think President Putin has got to juggle two wings of opinion. I was in Russia all last week. I speak mainly with bankers and businessmen. They do not want war. They do not want to break up the Ukraine. They want to continue normal business and see the Ukrainian economy grow. There is also a faction that would love to wave the flag. We've seen some of that already in the Crimea. That is not the direction to go in. And the question is, can President Putin keep a lid on those militaristic radicals and keep the normal business and normal diplomacy moving forward? That's the challenge. The spirit of Sochi, in which they have a $50 billion investment, should prevail here. A spirit of internationalism, of friendship, and of understanding. That's the hope that friends of Ukraine and friends in Russia who are thinking clearly have for the country today.
But do you think that President Putin will be listening to them and not the other side that you talked about a little earlier?
He has been eloquent with his silence. We haven't heard from President Putin. He has not been rattling the saber. He has not been shouting threats. He's been extremely silent. And for the moment, I hope that his silence is a hopeful sign that he feels he can keep the lid on the militarists and give full support to Sergei Lavrov and the diplomats and to the normal business and banking relationships that Russia has with Ukraine. We should all pray for that outcome. The spirit of Sochi should prevail.
Now, you used to work for the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development, and you were responsible for countries in the former Soviet Union. What does Ukraine need to do if we get back to the economy? What does Ukraine need to do in order to get its economy on an even keel again?
It needs to do what Poland has done, what the Czech Republic has done, Slovakia, and that is to normalize the economy, reduce corruption, operate according to sound business and banking principles. People thought that these countries couldn't do it. Most of them have. Ukraine is a laggard. But Ukraine, there's no built-in obstacle to keep Ukraine from doing that. Getting rid of Yanukovych, who was a corrupt leader, and his corruption is now visible for all to see, was a first step in the right direction.
So are you hopeful or are you pessimistic?
There's no room for pessimists in a situation like this. I am definitely hopeful. I know a lot of Ukrainians, highly intelligent people, well-educated, well aware of what they need to do to get their country off its knees and standing at its true height.
All right. On that note of optimism, we're going to wrap up this interview. I want to thank you, Ronald Freeman, for taking the time to speak to us here at France 24. And we're also going to be wrapping up this program. Thank you for watching the business interview here on France 24. And do stay with us. We have more news coming your way.